Okay, so I'm here to talk about the PEDSnet data quality with Connor. So a little bit of background about PEDSnet. So we are a clinical data research network. We started with 8 institutions. Now we're 7, but adding a couple more, so we're kind of very in flux. And it's children's hospitals. So the current members right now are Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, Cincinnati Children's, Nemours, Nationwide, Seattle, Colorado, St. Louis. I think I got them all. So we get the data on a quarterly, they send us data on a quarterly basis from their EHR. And so we have a database that contains this large data set standardized to the OMOP Common Data Model. Actually, we call it the PEDSnet data model because we've made some adaptations to the OMOP data model, but it's mostly aligned. So the data flow is that the 7 sites and then the sites that are going to be added on a quarterly basis, they extract data, and we have an extensive ETL document that they use to kind of guide their ETL practice. They send it to us, and then we merge it, and we have an instance of PEDSnet and an instance of PEDSnet, and then we use that data for data quality, query fulfillment research, data science, data modeling, and whatever else we want to use the network for. So we have, I think now, about 6 million children in this database. So just a little bit of background. We kind of started with data quality because it was a necessity. We weren't really thinking very deeply about what needed to be done or how to formulate checks, and we just kind of started because we had all this data and we had no way of knowing if there were issues or if there were problems with the data. So we just started with an Excel spreadsheet that had like 8 of the sites, and then trying to compute missingness across the sites. And so we've grown a little bit since then. And so now we have, as we've expanded the data quality theoretical framework, we've take into consideration things like our conventions and our ETL documents. So whatever we say, however we're asking people to pull their data from the ETL specifications, we want to make sure they're actually complying. So we develop data quality checks to make sure that that is happening. So for example, 9202 visits in OMOP should correspond to outpatient header diagnoses and things like that. So we use some of those checks. Data requests, when people come in, and we've gotten basically almost every research request we've gotten have asked about specialty data, so that we decided that we were going to focus and ask sites to focus their data quality efforts on making sure that specialty data is available to researchers. Just general standards and terminologies, and we've really used the CON framework for that. Making sure that what we have in PEDSnet also aligns with PEDSnet, because we participate in both research networks, and then whatever we think we'll be needing. So as we started to incorporate more and more checks besides just a broad missingness, we created a catalog. And so I'll show you actually the catalog in a second, but the basic idea is that there's a list of these catalogs, and these AA, BA, they correspond to the CON categories. For example, I have like future event highlighted. So that check will look for, it's a general check, and you can apply it to as many tables or domains as needed to kind of figure out specific issues that arise. But that's the general check. So let me actually go, our standards, the catalog is available on GitHub on our on the PEDSnet. So it's github.com/PEDSnet, data quality analysis, and then you go to data, and there's this DQA catalog. And this kind of categorizes all of the checks that we have. So it's kind of small. I don't know if you can see it, but there's the check code, the check type, for example, value set violation, what it defines, what the function is, the framework from the Michael Kahn harmonized terminologies, what it returns, and then the number of required tables, number of required variables, and then whether we've kind of automated this or not. So this is kind of our DQA catalog that you can kind of look at to see if there are check categories that you are interested in learning more about. So going back to this, so based on the Michael Kahn framework, we've categorized our checks into the following. So for conformance, we have the value set violation, invalid concept identifier, inconsistencies between primary key and the source value field, and et cetera. You can read those. I won't read through all of them. But again, these can be used in multiple tables and multiple domains, depending on what you want to look at, and apply it as necessary. And then we have conformance relation, completeness, our plausibility checks, and we've added a few plausibility validation checks as well. So we have this is a summary of all of the check types that we currently incorporate into the DQA. And what it does, there's an output, and so actually my colleague Connor is going to go through the actual implementation of the data quality. But basically what it does is then it outputs a CSV where it takes the field and then it tells you which check was applied and then what the finding was. So, for this, the admitting source value was missing 94.84%. And that's kind of what the output of the package will tell you. Right, so I don't know if it's helpful to go through more, but just general ideas that there's a check type, there's the field that it was applying, and then the result. And then you can use this however you want. You can create different thresholds and figure out how to adjust for that. So again, Connor will go through the exact process, but basically we use three programs. R is the main program that we kind of use for developing the checks. And then the output will all be in GitHub when we produce issues for people to respond to, for our sites to improve the ETL process, and then we try to rank data quality issues as they come up. So we produce these reports, and then we have these rankings, and there's some visualization, and there's just some GitHub issues that are automated for people to kind of incorporate into their workflow. Again, more detail coming up. And this is just an example of a GitHub issue that was created. So for this, for example, there was an unexpected change in the number of records between data cycles. And so the finding is posted on a particular site's GitHub. They have every site has their own GitHub, and then they respond and say, well, this is the reason is because, and then that's posted, and then it's kind of worked through until there's a resolution. So this is just showing the number of data quality checks that we have, and then how that kind of over time, as our checks increase, we've had more issues arise. Issues being problems that have come up or that we've posted on GitHub about. This is the number of reported issues based on the domain, the table. So this is kind of older data, but you can see that we have a lot of issues with drug exposure and measurement. And then the check type distribution, the distribution of what our biggest issues have been. So there's temporal outliers, missing data is always an issue, and some of these other, and these all, again, correspond to what's in our catalog. So I'm going to pause there before we talk about where we're headed, and Connor will kind of walk through the DQA process that we have in place.
Can I ask about the GitHub part? So is that being used just by developers, or are you having subject matter experts, business, clinical people coming in using GitHub to help provide feedback on the issues?
Yeah, sorry, I should have specified that. So the GitHub is there as a tool for the Data Coordinating Center at PEDSnet, which we're both a part of, to communicate with the ETL analysts at each site. So they're very familiar with the technical, they all push their ETL and their code to their GitHub repository, and then when these issues come up, they're posted as data quality issues for these sites to address. So each one of these, anyone can really access it from each site, but really the people who we are producing this information for are the ETL analysts, so that they can actually make the changes needed in their ETL.
If I understood correctly, you have data converted from the source to OMAP and from there to PCORI format.
Yeah.
And so PCORI has its own 400, 500 tests they perform. Are you a test application of PCORI or additional ones?
Are you talking about the data quality?
Yes.
Yeah, so what we try and do, not every single one is yet incorporated into our data quality package, but things that we realize are problems. For example, we've had problems with specimens, and so we are trying to incorporate the specimen checks in PEDSnet into our DQA package in PEDSnet, so that it is streamlined and concordant with what PEDSnet is checking for as well. It's still not 100%. We have to get better about aligning the two, but we're trying.
Thank you. Hey everybody, so I'm Connor Callahan. I'm a data scientist at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. Specifically, I work for the Data Coordinating Center under PEDSnet. And so I'm going to go through a little bit of the nuts and bolts of our DQA process. First off, I'm going to go over some background and kind of go over kind of a little bit more of that process that we were just discussing. From there, I'm going to kind of go over how to run the DQA, give you the gist of the steps you would take to set it up. From there, I'll give you a peek under the hood with exactly what's going on in our code. Finally, I'll kind of take us through some of those results and ultimately what we're currently working on. So in terms of background, and sorry if there's a little bit of overlap, but we're putting our data to work. We are utilizing this data for studies where we're sending out data sets to investigators. We're performing our own analyses and research, and we're meeting funding requirements. So in order to do all those things, we have to have a robust data quality process in place. And so that's exactly what our toolkit accomplishes for us. We're taking data in from 7 distinct sites, and each with their own EHR system in place, and we're trying to standardize it in such a way that all of that data is top-notch and uniform. So in order to do that with an evolving CDM, we have to have a DQA that is constantly evolving to meet our needs. So here in this diagram, we can kind of see an overview of how it works. The site will have its EHR, performance ETL on it, send us that data. From there, I'll run our DQA toolkit on it, create issues from that DQA that we store locally, and ultimately curate feedback for those sites. That's then posted to GitHub. If there's something that's really alarming, we'll try to get that site to send another version to us. But otherwise, there's an optional resubmission wherein they can submit another thing for that quarter. Otherwise, we'll just run with it, and ultimately that OMOP's CDM is transformed into the PEDSnet CDM, and then further data characterization is run on it. So in order to really make this work, we have to make sure that we have a workflow in place that works for us. And so to get into a little bit more detail, so this data is being sent to us securely as flat files. From there, we clean it and upload it to a Postgres instance on our end, and then our DQA process runs on that database. in order to actually share what's output from that DQA toolkit with those ETL analysts, we use GitHub. And so there's a lot of risk here in that every time you run this DQA process, tons of issues are output. So you don't want to spam those ETL analysts with the same thing every time. And so we've really leveraged GitHub in order to try to reduce that fatigue. So the way that we do that is we use the labeling systems that are available on GitHub, and we combine that with a Go program. So we can label something as either an ETL issue, which is really what we're after, something that's just a programming error, a mapping error that can be fixed, or something that's characteristic and something that we're not going to be able to easily tackle, something that that site may not be able to capture. There's also improvements. So for example, say there's a 30% jump in the number of records in a table, we would still consider that an issue because it's a little bit alarming, but it could just be that they finally figured out how to capture this specific field. And so as long as we get that explanation, everything's in good shape. And finally, sometimes things go wrong on our end. And so that would be a workflow error. Yeah.
Sorry, I just wanted to understand, is you're using GitHub issues or you're using GitHub documents?
Issues.
Okay.
And I'll show some of these a little bit later on. So on top of that, we have a secondary labeling system that tries to rank order how our site should actually tackle these issues. Pretty straightforward, low, medium, and high. Low is generally something that doesn't touch a lot of records, so something like under 1% of a table. Medium is something that we have a little bit higher of an expectation that it's going to be an ETL issue, but is very likely going to just be a characteristic issue that can't be resolved. And then high importance issues are issues that are very likely ETL or something that's just very alarming that could throw off ultimately what's going to happen when we transform to PEDSnet. So it's really just a process of working through each of these issues with ETL analysts, and these labeling systems have essentially enabled us to kind of narrow that conversation so we can just get through them every data cycle quickly, easily, and efficiently, while still facilitating a conversation between us and them that ultimately tries to resolve each of these issues over time. So this is a distribution from one of our data submission cycles. You can see that ETL issues in red are highly concentrated in high-level issues. Blue, more concentrated in the low-level issues. Everything in white is something that at the time that this image was taken during our quarterly call, we were still waiting on sites to hear back on. So there's always going to be that relationship where you're working with the analysts, hoping that they find the time to improve upon their ETL, but we expect them to work through those highest important issues first. And so we do see that overall that the high level issues have the lowest number of under review tags. And so this is kind of an idea of what we're looking at. This is across all 7 of our sites from this data cycle. And so it's really a process, not just in implementing a coding structure that identifies issues, but finding a way to develop solutions. So now I'm going to take you a little bit through how to actually run our DQA code. So it's publicly available on GitHub. Anybody can access it. I think Kanye may have showed this page earlier, and I expect most people in here are probably familiar with GitHub, but for anyone who isn't, it's pretty straightforward. You just go click clone, hit this little thing to copy it, and then in your terminal, you just do git clone. And that will give you a copy of our entire DQA package. So this one's pretty bare bones. I'm not actually going to work with it. I have one that's already been run and prepared. But this is something that's constantly changing over time. At the very least quarterly, I'm pushing updates according to how our CDM has changed for that quarter. And so it's something that we're actively working to improve. I should also mention that right now, our DQA currently only supports Oracle and Postgres. It's not too far of a stretch of the imagination to see it supporting other relational databases, but at the moment, these are the only 2 we can truly say we have that I can vouch for. So in order to run it from here, you're going to need any necessary packages. These are pretty detailed on the repo on GitHub. I can show it to you rather quickly. So everything here is more or less pretty standard at first. And then down below, we have some of the little more esoteric packages. To be honest, we're not using SQL render or database connector anymore. Over the past year, we've pretty much completely migrated to the tidyverse and using the package here, the Argos package that Charles Bailey at CHOP has developed for easily connecting to databases. So this essentially, between this package and the tidyverse, this is how we're doing all of our manipulations on the database, and essentially sending those queries that the data quality package will rely on. So to get into a little bit more about these configuration files in that Argos package, from the top directory, if you go to resources and you go to PEDSnet config.yaml, which is what's open here, this file is how you establish what schemas your DQA is going to pull from. On top of that, there's also a file path that will link you to that Argos config JSON. So the Argos package that I'm going to go into a little bit after this is really what's establishing that connection with the database. And then from here, this is really how you do version control. The site directory is where all the output from our DQA is stored. And then from here, you have things like the ETL and DQA script versions, what CDM you're using, and conventions. So Argos ideally can provide a little bit of password protection. At our actual institution, we use hidden.argos folders, but for the purpose of this tutorial, I've created a visible one. And so this is what it looks like inside of it if you're trying to connect to the SynPuff data. So here you have your host name, your port, user, password, the typical stuff. And so just setting up these config files is probably the most complicated part of actually getting our DQA process to run. It's pretty well documented on that repository, so if anybody wants to try it, you hopefully have enough resources available. So in terms of actually running this DQA, this is also pretty straightforward. Just from the top directory of it, make sure that that's your working directory. Oops. Go to this run dqa.r file in that top directory, source it, and then from here, oops. From here, you have two options. You can generate a single report, and what I mean by report is essentially a single table within the CDM, or you can call run DQA, which will just iterate through each of the reports that we have available. So to demonstrate, if I was just going to do generate a single report, then I would just put in the level, a little bit more on that later, and the table that I want to run it on. And then from there, it'll just go through, run all the checks, create all the images that we want to output. And overall, it doesn't take too long. But for now, I'm going to keep pushing forward. So on top of that, in the top level directory, if you're worried about any sort of errors or issues popping up, or just validating that everything ran clean, we also have a log file available. And essentially what this log file is going to do is just provide any errors. It won't just print out everything that the DQA prints out, but it'll provide you with some basis of information for what happened. So for example, when I did run DQA earlier, there's no easily accessible immunization table to run on. So here we can see that it doesn't exist. Meanwhile, things like the location report were available and it was able to run successfully. So this is how we really keep track of what's going on. And you can see that here it's finished. So to get into the nuts and bolts of what's actually going on under the hood, I'm going to try not to swamp you with too many details, but just kind of navigate you through some of the top 3 most important directories for understanding what's going on. The data directory has these 3 subdirectories. So this one is pretty much exactly what Hanya showed earlier on the GitHub repo. This is just a basic bit of information about every check that's listed, as well as this inventory file. It's a little bit cleaner on the GitHub repo, but so I won't go through it again here. But you can see these things like these blurbs that just kind of describe what it is. These also get posted to GitHub so that the ETL analyst has an idea of what's going on. On top of that, you can also just kind of glance into some of these files to see what information those checks would actually care about. So one thing that's pretty straightforward is thresholding. So if something's changing, for example, here, a change in the number of fact types between data cycles, then you're going to need to know what we qualify as an issue in terms of a change. So here, for example, we're saying if a condition type concept ID jumped by over 10% or dropped whatsoever, then that's going to be an issue for us. In the next folder, we can see information that's pretty critical to some of these checks. So if you're going to compare data cycles and see how things are changing over time, you have to know how the data was beforehand. This is where we store that information. So for example, here in this total fact types count file, I just kind of filled it in with 1,000, but you can see that we're keeping track of, for example, how many outpatient visits were available, how many inpatient visits and inpatient condition headers. So this is where we keep track of that information. It's output by the DQA. And so a matter of running this on previous output is just essentially moving that output from that output directory to this folder. And I'll go on later about where that output is stored. And finally, we have value sets. So this is kind of where we get into more table-specific information. So in terms of what is a valid route concept ID, these are the filtering conditions that we would apply to it. We would say that the domain ID has to be route and that there can't be an invalid reason for that concept ID. The other approach to that is that you just have a list of what we currently consider a valid concept ID. So in this case, drug type concept ID, wherein you essentially just read these in and check for any concept IDs that don't fall into this list. So really this data directory is just about providing information that's essential to those checks. So our library folder is where the magic happens. That's where all of our checks are stored. So for example, a missing concept ID here, we're pulling in some information from the catalog up here and implementing the check down below. So it's generalized to any table or field of interest to you. So that information is read in, and then the logic's applied to actually implement the check. Ultimately, if an issue is generated, then we write it to a log. If not, then we just return. Additionally, in this directory, there's some functions that make our code more generalized. So perform database operations is essentially generalizing how we interact with the database rather than coding up each individual check in and putting SQL statements or tidyverse functions into there. We simply summarize it into these database functions so we don't have to change each individual check every time that deployer updates or something like that. And we just maintain it through this file. We also have a plotting utility script doing essentially the same thing for us, where we just have certain types of plots that we know we want, and we contain all that information in here. So here's an example of what one of those plots would look like. This is used in our temporal outliers check, where we're essentially seeing if there's erratic jumps month to month in the number of records in a given field. So for here in the visit start date, we see that there's a huge jump in the number of visit start dates available throughout pretty much 2008. So this is something that would throw an issue for us in that check. And this is the sort of plot that we would refer back to using that script. Finally, the Finally, there's the main directory. So we touched on this a little bit. There's 2 levels. So this isn't something that we're necessarily set on, where we've considered merging these 2 levels together. But right now, the idea is that our first level checks are univariate checks, so looking at each table individually, going through each field and performing whatever checks we find necessary about that field. Whereas our level 2 is, I guess, if we want to kind of use the word loosely, multivariate, where essentially we're pulling in different tables and different fields from different tables and implementing a little bit more sophisticated checks. So I can kind of take you through just very briefly what one of those reports would look like. So this is all of our reports. So here I've pulled up the condition report. You can see at the top, it pulls in the table, it starts a log file that will essentially be our issues that are output to a CSV. And then we just go through field by field and implement every check that interests us. So for example, condition occurrence ID, we want to count how many there are and then use that in this unexpected difference check. So this would be for the next data cycle, and then we're using the last data cycle's counts here and actually running that check. And so it's just a process of running through each of these fields, finding out the information that interests us, and then at the very end, writing it, outputting it in a way that is useful to us. From level 2, we have a couple more, we have more scripts that are again running more sophisticated checks across multiple fields. So this is where something like inconsistent visit types for a condition occurrence show up, where we have a header not matching the associated visit concept ID. And so here we're just outputting those results again in a pretty similar way. And so that's pretty much kind of a glimpse at what's going on under the hood. But now I think it's a lot more interesting to look at some of the output and what we're actually doing. So if we take a glimpse into that results directory for what we ran before, we can see here we have a couple more directories under it. The data directory is keeping track of that information that I was saying would ultimately go back into that previous data file folder beforehand. All of our images are output here. Our reports kind of utilize those images to make these kind of nifty markdown files that just summarize information about that given domain. And then ultimately, the crux of the issue is this issues directory. So this is what we really want to look into, and this is what we're going to actually convey back to our ETL analysts. What's up?
Sorry, I got lost with the results directory. That's not public, or?
It's public to the institution that it's run for. So they can look at it.
You won't see it in the stuff that you're looking at on GitHub.
Right. Well, you won't be able to look for any given hospital's results. But if you implement this on your own end, or if you look at the SimPuff data, you'd be able to see it.
I see. So the results will get generated, but they're not in the GitHub repo.
They're not in the public repo. There's an individual repo that's private for each institution. So these issues are really what we're focused on here. So these are essentially what are copied over to GitHub. And if we take a glimpse into what one of them looks like, so we ran the person table before, we can see that there's a couple of things that are missing here. And there's an unexpected change, not too big of a surprise since I just threw 1,000 in there. And so here, this is all the issues that our DQAs found for this particular table. And we can cycle through them. There's a couple more. For example, here we can see there's a lot more going on. We wouldn't necessarily want to throw 15 issues at a site every data cycle. That leads to issue fatigue. It kind of damages that relationship with the ETL analyst. And so it's really important that we utilize this Go program to essentially filter what we're actually sharing. So some examples. So I got permission to show a couple of what's actually going on. So here's an example from not too long ago where there's an illegal vocabulary in the condition occurrence table, RX norm. We expect that predominantly in our drug exposure table. And so our ETL analyst at CHOP was able to work through it and ultimately found a resolution to that issue. We found a solution, determined it was an ETL issue, and closed the issue. And so it kind of continues on like this. Unexpected change in the number of records. So this is what we're working with, communicating with the ETL analysts. Here's one that's a characteristic issue, something that's just going to keep coming back. So it looks pretty dramatic at first. It's a 17% drop in the number of records in a table. So this is something that, you know, is pretty alarming to us, but ultimately was not actually an issue because there had been a change that the site had actually implemented wherein they had migrated those headers to, those visit concept IDs to a new concept ID that was added to our CDM. And so we expected this drop. And so in this case, we consider that an improvement.
So Connor, can you say what a characteristic issue is? I'm not sure it was defined earlier. So.
Sure. So a characteristic issue, or what we're labeling as persistent here, is something that we essentially don't expect to go away. It's a true anomaly for that site or just a difficulty that they're experiencing that will delay an improvement in their ETL process. So in order to avoid bombarding them with that issue again, that characteristic description in our Go program essentially prevents that issue from being reposted. And here we can see another one where we actually had to go back and kind of edit this check because it triggered very frequently. We were seeing a lot of temporal outliers come up pretty much every data cycle, and it was kind of damaging to that relationship with the ETL analysts. And so it was really a matter of going in and kind of really making it a little bit stricter so that in order to actually have a temporal outliers issue, we are, there's a very stricter set of constraints applied. And so I'm just gonna end on current goals. So like I said, our DQA process continues to evolve. We're improving checks based on user feedback. We hear back from those ETL analysts, they tell us what they think, and that's kind of what led to something like that temporal outliers improvement. We're adding new fields every now and again, a new domain or table as well. And we're continuing to develop new checks and put them into our DQA process. So if something is continuously going wrong and that we noticed in our studies, then we would try to develop a check in our DQA in order to capture it at this point. On top of that, we're also looking to add a little bit more metadata to our overall DQA process. There's a lot of information that's pulled in throughout each of these checks, and we want to store that alongside with the site when it was run and try to understand exactly how sites have improved over time and evaluate how we're doing as well. And so with that, I just want to thank everybody who has helped on this DQA process. Hanya Razagi, Ritu Kher, who used to work on this and really kind of began this initiative at our institution. And I'll hand it back over to Hanya.
So the question is to clarify the data pipeline from the EHR, from the different hospital systems to PEDSnet, and like the format and the data structures and where this check is actually being done.
Okay, so to kind of go over it, and then I'll kind of summarize it, and then maybe if something kind of throws you off, then point out, I guess, where it is. So each of these hospitals has their own EHR. They run their ETL that we try to standardize through a lot of collaboration on that EHR. They send it to us as a flat file securely. We upload it to the database. From that database, I run this DQA process on it. And then from there, the issues that this DQA process outputs are posted to GitHub.
So the formatting, the data structures of those flat files, are they in like a OAuth CDM?
So
You mean the flat files that the site sent us?
Yes.
Yeah, they're all in
Yeah.
the OAuth CDM structure as CSV files. When they do the ETL, it's standardized through OAuth.
Thank you.
Should we save other questions till later? I mean, Honey, if you want to go.
Yeah, I think we can, however you want to do it, we're just kind of, there's things that are not part of the tool yet that we're kind of hoping to put in, and I just wanted to cover some of those as well. I'm happy if you can answer more questions specifically to the tool.
I figured you might be about to answer some questions that people might have in their mind, and so if we see what you have to present, that people might save unanswered questions for then. Does that make sense to you? Great.
I'll come back up.
Sure. Okay, let me just quickly. So, things that we want to improve in our current DQA structure, we want to streamline the code a little bit more. Connor's done a lot in terms of streamlining everything to dplyr, which we use. But basically thinking about how to, some of the other ideas that we have, how to incorporate it all into the package and make it a little bit more user-friendly. Interoperability of the, as Connor mentioned, we can vouch for Oracle and Postgres, but other DBMSs, not yet. To make data characterization more extensive, so kind of transitioning from a data quality issue to data characterization, and making things more queryable for sites if they needed to, and to incorporate some semantic data quality. So one of the things that we've incorporated are kind of site-by-site comparisons. So a lot of the issues that Connor went over are site-specific. So we generate these issues and we post them all to these site-specific repositories on GitHub. But there's nothing that kind of benchmarks right now how sites are doing in relation to each other. So we're trying to create some sort of, okay. Sorry. I'll submit updates later. Okay, so for this, for example, we looked at lab data and looking at where the measurement concept ID is uninformative, where there's missing data. And so we are trying to benchmark sites against each other so that they can actually look and see it. And so we've created all the R code for this, and it's almost ready. It's just we haven't yet streamlined it into our main DQA, and it's not yet publicly available, but it is something that we're hoping to put out there. So this was important because we kept getting the question from sites in this multi-network how they do in comparison to other people on these same issues. And then we started to think about how to bridge the gap between informaticists' view on data quality and researchers' views on data quality. And so this is kind of our next phase, and we've started some work on this. So basically, and the informaticist is very concerned about the data model and the source system and making sure there's validity and were these things handled correctly. And then researchers, no matter how good some of what we think our data quality is based on that, if they get something that just doesn't make any sense to them, they think that the data is all garbage. So this is something we're trying to figure out how to do. So for example, we have done a lot of studies with glomerular disease. We have a paper that's going to be published soon about a computable phenotype for glomerular disease. But for this, we're thinking, okay, if a patient and a group of patients with glomerular disease, what are the things that they would need to know. And maybe we can think of these kind of beforehand. And so things like how many of them had biopsies, how many of them have inpatient visits, or at least a visit with a nephrologist. And so you would need to kind of do this evaluation to make sure that some of this data is fit for purpose. And so we actually implemented this for a benchmarking study that we did for one of the studies that we're doing, looking at quality benchmarks for different conditions. So here it was otitis media, antipsychotic drug utilization, and sickle cell disease. And we created a index data quality score for each site that participated in the network. And this was based on missingness and other sorts of things. And it's similar. And this was another study that we actually formalized, not just on missingness of key variables, but actually developed what we call a data alignment index for PEDSnet antibiotic demonstration study, which we're hoping to write up, which we haven't yet. But this basically is kind of formalizing a way to look at the major study variables and computing missingness and informativeness and coming up with some sort of composite, and then being able to apply that systematically in these studies. So this is, just us thinking about how to develop some sort of systematic approach to doing these for each study, and this is kind of the experience that we've had so far, but we have no systematic way yet of incorporating these things into our data quality. But again, this was for that antibiotic study, coming up with a data quality index per site. So again, that sites can benchmark against each other how well their data contributed to the network. And we actually ended up dropping some of the sites in red from the analysis because their data just wasn't good to use. Yeah.
Can you describe that a little more?
Describe that a little bit more. So we use this metric, and sites that did poorly scored poor, like they got a low DQ score. Yeah. This. Yeah. So that was so you can see the different equations. So it's kind of like a standard deviation of the major variables. So the antibiotic prescriptions, the steroid prescriptions, and anti-reflux medications that were used in the study, looking to see the fraction receiving at least one. So it's basically a missingness index. And then using that with what there's a study out there by somebody, Damont, but she basically looked at how to compute errors in weights and heights in databases. And so we applied that as well to compute a height error and a weight error, and then kind of incorporated that into our overall data quality index combined with the medication index score. And we came up with some sort of composite, again, to be published soon, hopefully. So that's the index that we came up with, yeah.
So this was framed specifically for this study?
Exactly. So what we're hoping to do is kind of take these principles and be able to create some sort of systematic approach of how to do this for studies, which we have not yet. Yeah.
So did you apply this score to the entire database at each site, or was it just against the, I guess, sub-cohort of the study?
Just the sub-cohort for the study. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
When you say site, do you mean separate CDM instance or a pure site?
Yeah, sorry, that was unclear. So we meant like by site, we mean like an institution or hospital contributing data for the study. So for PEDSnet, it's like a huge consortium of different either institutions or data marts, or however they, like each group that has a data, has their data in an instance of the PEDSnet data model. So this was using PEDSnet, not OMAP. I'm sorry? There are no, so they're all using the PEDSnet data model, but they're different instances of it, yeah. So this could be like I don't know, Duke University, PEDSnet was one of the, like the different institutions that contribute data to PEDSnet, like St. Louis or CHOP or whatever. Yeah.
Kind of curious, so sites, as you just explained it, a site, as you just explained it, could have multiple sites at that site. Like they could have different locations that have fairly different practices. So if you took site at that level, you might get vastly different data quality scores. And is that ever an issue or something that you think about? Like, if we took it from St. Louis's main hospital, we would get some really good numbers, but since they've combined in all of their satellite clinics.
Yeah, we haven't found a good way yet to be able to do that. We've mostly been doing it at the site level. Yeah, to incorporate that way. Yeah. And again, this was study specific. The DQA correlations, we were looking at the steroid metric and the antibiotic metric and seeing, if sites do poorly on one, do they do poorly on the other? And so similar sort of concept. And then the last thing that we, sorry, I have one more slide after this as well, but other things that we've been applying more broadly, trying to get at the semantic question, are things like, so we were looking at drug utilization here, and we were looking at, for example, albuterol among children diagnosed with asthma. And so for each one of these, there's a complex thought process of, well, how do you define children with asthma? If they have just one diagnosis, is that going to be good? Or should we require multiple diagnoses? And then, when should the albuterol be prescribed and this sort of thing? So we kind of have to go through pretty complicated process and come up with some of these scores. But you can see that, like, for one of our sites, there was 0 albuterol among children diagnosed with asthma, and that is problematic. So if we just looked at missing drugs, for example, across the entire network, it wouldn't give you this kind of meaning that we're looking for. So we're trying to incorporate more of these kinds of checks into our mainstream DQA, but the code is just not yet publicly available. And finally, this is a similar sort of thing where it's providing information. We used k-means clustering here to look at, and I actually don't even remember which drug we used for this, but again, looking to see if there are outliers among sites in terms of drug utilization and providing that sort of feedback. So whether it's graphs like this or something like this, we don't know yet. This is next steps in DQA. And so, acknowledgments. So Connor, do you want to come up? So more questions for Connor and I? One right there.
Yeah, thanks. I'm curious about the rationalization for moving towards Argos and away from SQL Render. It seemed, I think last year you guys had a little bit of support for it, but yeah, it seems like a really great tool, but we're a SQL Server shop, so it seems like we wouldn't be able to use that. Is there a plan moving forward for just using Argos or incorporating more?
So maybe you can talk a bit about the history of Argos, but for what I can say right now, for us, for our use cases and what we're doing at PEDSnet, using the tidyverse and the Argos package was more in line in our interest. For us, it was a little bit slicker and quicker, and so we ultimately wound up moving towards that implementation.
Yeah, no, that's right. And Argos is more like about the database connector, and then it worked better with the dplyr and tidyverse package, as Connor said, because we found that dplyr was easier to work with in terms of database and also more efficient. So we just switched over to that completely.
Yeah, so I bet you get asked this question very often. So why distinction? It's like the quality checks you have done are so great and are are something to be very sparse. But if I want to consume that in a usual CDM, is not a straightforward part, right? So then the question is like, what was the need that prompts the departure for not just using the CDM? Because these among other many things that you will start doing that are very, very good. Like I'm very not just surprised, but it's awesome. It will take some effort that may not be very trivial to actually be consumed by a standard CDM. So.
Right, and I can certainly see that point of view. I think for our specific purposes, it was really a matter of our concern of making it work in the way that we had already set up with both Oracle and Postgres, as well as quickly as possible. I could certainly see it almost maybe a potential use case in re-implementing those older packages and more of a DQA classic version for public availability. But as things currently stand, our own use cases have demanded that we move on towards this other framework.
And was your question about the DBMSs that are being supported or the actual CDM? So I think the question wasn't so much about Argos. It was sounded like it was following on Robert's, but I think it was more about the changes to the OMOP CDM that have been implemented in PEDSnet and the rationale there.
So I think really what we have is more of an extension upon that CDM. It's not that we've cut anything else out. It's really that we've built upon that table because there's a lot of information that, the OMOP CDM captures a lot of the information we're interested in, but we also cater to PEDSnet, and we have our own interests on top of that really just kind of expand beyond the OMOP model. I don't think there's anything particularly lacking in our implementation. It's really just about growing beyond currently where it is.
So you guys have a specimen table. I don't know what else is. Dropping a couple of tables might be all that's required, I guess, is my impression.
Yeah, so some of the examples, for example, we added a gestational age field in the person table. Our use case demanded the creation of what we call a measurement organism table, which is looking at specific bacterial infection types, and that isn't captured in the measurement table. Or what we had, the ADT occurrence table, which is transfers to ICUs, because that wasn't currently being captured. But everything that's in OMOP, we've standardized to there. These are, as Connor said, just extensions for our use case.
I just wanted to throw out there that you could do dplyr and tidyverse with all of the Odyssey tool, with feature extraction and all of the R tools in Odyssey. Argos, I guess, is only going to support the two databases, maybe. But if you can still do SQL render and get all of the benefits of tidyverse. It's just not conventional because I think Martijn doesn't like tidyverse, but I really like tidyverse, so I'm throwing it in my code.
Yeah, that's certainly something to keep in consideration, especially if we wanted to re-implement it for public availability.
And I think Argos can work with any sort of package. It's mostly the database connection that it's using.
To the last point you made about adjusting your model, have you brought any of those as proposals forward to the CDM builders in Odyssey?
Yes, we have. We haven't. So I know, for example, that the CDM group has been working on creating more granular visit type data, and I'm not sure when that's being released or if it's been released, but it's things like that, and we've talked to them about it and have participated. I will be the first to admit that we're not probably as active in pushing some of this as we could be, but for example, a while ago we added a timestamp so we had like a birth time instead of just the year and day, and then later they included it as well. So then we switched our naming conventions to match that of what they did as well. So now it's birth date time.
Do you have your modifications published anywhere like that?
So we have an extensive ETL document that we publish on our website that has all of our conventions, everything, not just what we've adopted, but basically whatever the analysts are using at their site to convert, we have put up on our website. And yeah, I don't know if it's worth going through, but.
A lot of, I work with Picori, some other sites there, but some things that's specific to Picori, that a lot of sites extended within OMA to support Picori. It has nothing to do with specific things that you want to extend within OMA that have to do with Picori.
Yeah, we've done some extension. Well, I mean, everything that PecorNet requires, we've somehow adapted the OMOP data model to be able to accommodate that, yeah.
So there is a conception that the transformation process that we have in OMOP CDM is affecting the data in terms of quality and in terms of information loss. Have you done any analysis in terms of whether OMOP CDM transformation has any impact on data quality, how it compares to other data models like PecorNet?
Yeah, that's a really, really good point. I think, some of the fact that we are standardizing terminologies is great in theory, but there's potential for information loss. And so that actually came up. So as I was going through the slides, I talked about glomerular disease and how we've done a lot of work with that. And as we were developing the phenotype, there was one code in SNOMED called glomerular sclerosis, which our nephrologist said, yes, that's glomerular disease. But what happened was sites that were pulling from their billing data, the ICD-9 code that matches to glomerular disease was like kidney disease NOS, or something, that obviously did not transfer well. And so as we started the chart reviews, we were getting very low positive predictive values for this code. And we were like, wait, why? And we realized that this was the reason. And so we recognize the need for it. And as we're talking about the semantic DQA, I think terminology is going to be one that we're going to focus on. We haven't yet developed a systematic way of being able to kind of quantify that type of measure information loss, though, but we've definitely seen it affect our studies. So that's a really good point.
So one really cool thing that I saw was just cohort-specific data quality measure, and with like sort of the advent of the gold standard phenotype library, it would be really cool to kind of marry these two things. So you have like phenotypes and data quality checks that go hand in hand.
Yeah, I think that's actually a really, really good idea. And we have people in the room that can make this happen. That's a good idea.
So the checks in there, how many of them you think, and maybe this is a question both to you and to Ajit, how many you think might be suited to be new checks that would add to the 20 or so that are in the DQ dashboard, or vice versa, those that could accept? What would that translation process? They have a similar kind of a structure that they could define the kind of element from a kind of table, and then they go across all of those instances within the CDM. So
I think just speaking in broad strokes, I can see a lot of overlap. I can see a pretty easy transition from what we currently have moving into that implementation. Maybe there's a couple more very niche checks that we've implemented on our end that may or may not be useful, but overall, I think for the most part, a good chunk of what we have could be moved over.
So I think some of the, what you provide is so really, really high value, not only in terms of the scope of the checks and so on, but the entire process that you have developed. I mean, it's a whole ecosystem of looking at data quality with institutions so that you're able to ensure a standard of quality across them. And I think there's just, though the focus of this workshop is kind of on tools and how the tools work, they only really work within a context where people are using them and responding to them, and the product is getting produced to level. And you've done a great job to kind of give the structure of that. I would invite you to kind of say more about that, I think, because I don't think there are many data coordinating centers that have taken data quality as seriously as you all have and developed kind of as nuanced a perspective on how to do that the right way. You've kind of touched on relationship management and how to track, the resolution of errors and how to chart that over time. But I think it's worth sharing that in more detail if you all care to. I think that's a really valuable set of learnings that you have.
Sure. So I think, in some way or another, even if I haven't met all of them in person, I've really come to know a lot of these ETL analysts because I'm constantly, going through code, checking what we have on our end with our database and comparing it to what they have on their end. It's really a matter of back and forth, trying to figure out if there's any possible solutions. We oftentimes see that one site will figure out an implementation in their ETL that can be utilized by another site, and there just wasn't that coordination at first. But through that, that relationship building and really looking at the broader picture of things, we're able to make it all come together and really reach a higher level of standardization. So I think it's also really important to bring up that we meet regularly with all of our ETL analysts. We have bi-weekly meetings in order to ensure that everybody's on the same page and making sure that the CDM is up to date, that any issues that are currently unresolved with our DQA process do meet some sort of resolution, and that our data is ready just to be used both in studies as well as to be transformed into PEDSnet.
Yeah, I also want to add to that we have governance structures in place also that, each institution has an informatics lead and what they call a scientific lead, though I would argue that Okay, so what they mean by scientific lead is a health services researcher or an epidemiologist. So they, it's really important, and I think as a group we're coming to the consensus that this is important. It was important to begin with because we had this funding, and we got the okay to develop these data quality processes, and so there was a lot of engagement. And as time goes by, I feel like at the Data Coordinating Center we've been saying for a while, we need to expand DQA to think about X, Y, and Z, and sometimes that really doesn't happen because, there's fatigue from the ETL analysts, so they can't prioritize everything. So a lot of the times, once the scientific lead decides that it's important, then they will help us prioritize it, and they, will talk to their analysts and stuff. So there's a lot of politics management as well, and there's a lot of working with the governance structures to kind of help prioritize what's important. And I'm getting excited because as we send out data sets and the researchers get mad because of data quality, it serves as an impetus to do this kind of study-specific data quality that we're talking about, that we've been saying is important but haven't been able to get prioritized. But now that we're actually using the data, people are realizing that this is important. So.
Yeah, and so very much on that point, you touched briefly on the informaticist perspective and the investigator perspective, and if you would just say more about that. So that's somewhat related. I assume you weren't, the research perspective wasn't like how to goad researchers into creating the change that you want by getting them mad, but how what is the shape of that thought about how they are different and why it matters that they are different?
Yeah, so it's funny because from the beginning we have been trying to create dashboards and information about the data network, and anytime we put together something, we're from like the researchers, the health services researchers look at it and they're like, I don't know what to make of this. You know, I don't, okay, so missing concept IDs are 50%. What does that mean? But they know what it means that flu labs are missing in a cohort of patients with croup. Like, they know what that means. And so trying to bridge that gap is really, really difficult, because when we think about data quality, I think traditionally have been thinking, okay, missing concept IDs or concordance between visit type. So even like something as simple as concordance between visit type and condition headers, I think for us that's very meaningful, and PEDSnet has that same check. You know, it's good for us, but when we present this to health services researchers, they're just kind of like, okay, and like they don't quite understand that gap, and bridging that gap to get them to understand why this matters and then how to make it applicable to them is something that is constantly in flux. So that's where kind of the relationship management, the politics, and sometimes getting investigators to have bad data quality so that they know they can, that it becomes a priority. So that all, I think, contributes to what we're doing.
Would another gloss on that be that you some output is geared towards being actionable for the ETLers that you're working with, and other output is geared towards being meaningful for the people who want to use it in the research that the thing's being done?
Exactly.
Is that a good gist?
Yeah.
And I think it's a really important issue, and again, one I haven't seen really looked at much elsewhere, but it seems very important. We will not acknowledge that you are here, but you can speak as if from the abyss.
I made you. So just circling back to the data loss question, though, source value and source concept ID are maintained. Yeah. So is it necessarily? I understand if you run an analysis that focuses off of the mapped SNOMED concept ID, you're going to see something like that. But it's not necessarily that there's data loss as much as there is if you standardize your analysis on the standard concept, which is what the recommendation is. You'll see something different, but the data is still maintained. It itself isn't lost.
Yeah, no, that's true. It's just that we haven't traditionally used source values because they're not standardized. It's harder to use them in analyses, but they're there to help us debug, and they're there, and we've actually changed some of the form. Like, we have standardized condition source concept ID to mean the ICD concept instead of, like we twisted the definitions a little bit so that we can do that because actually a lot of the source concept ID we are asking sites not to pull from their billing data, so it really shouldn't be an ICD concept, but we maintain that because so many researchers want ICD. Sure. So we have standardized that field, for example, and same with condition source value. We are actually pulling oh my gosh, what is it? The EPIC. The IMO term, yes, we are asking them to send us their IMO term and condition source value. That's how much we're beginning to standardize those fields as well to help with this.
In the case of the ICD, though, you're not necessarily twisting it that far because ICD-9s, now that they have a standard concept, you could still have a condition like the source concept ID can map to that in the normal concept ID.
Right.
So
I think the semantics of that field, though, is supposed to be whatever the source is telling you, rather than like, so if they're pulling directly from their IMO to SNOMED, for example, we're saying ignore that for source value, for source concept ID, and pull the ICD-9 code.
Okay, I understand.
That's what we're doing.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Go ahead.
Is the formula different for different studies that you perform in there? Or?
Yeah, so that's why I'm saying we haven't yet come up with a standard formula or way. That's what we're hoping our next phase is going to be is to formalize, an approach to data quality that's reusable.
So each study, you could not just run a query for a cohort,
right,
and find out how many patients I have. If I have less than certain percentage, therefore the site will be good to submit for the study.
So we've been doing it ad hoc, and I've shown you some of the ad hoc, but we haven't done a lot yet with actual like, we haven't systematically approached it yet.
Okay.
That makes sense. Sorry, I don't mean my desktop to be on display there.
So you were just saying, honey, that you asked them to put the ICD-9 in there because...
Or ICD-10, but just an ICD
okay.
code.
I see.
Yeah.
I've just been wondering, I mean, everybody should be on ICD-10, but I
Yeah.
do keep hearing people talk about ICD-9 in current data, and I don't know if it's because people still want to see the ICD-9, or, I mean, there can't be people still capturing it during...
Yeah, I think it depends on the timing of the visit. If it's pre-conversion, the billing data could conceivably still be ICD-9 in source systems.
Right, but you're getting new data.
Yeah, we're getting new, so the new data, but we still have old data as well. So it depends on how that's stored in the source systems, that's all. Yeah.
Are there additional sites coming into PEDSnet?
Yes, I don't know that I can't disclose because I'm not sure that anyone's actually signed a contract, but we have been advertising. So we're hoping there are a few who are interested in joining as well. So.
All right. So Robert has kindly put up a link that you can all go to where we can collectively add wisdom, witticisms, whatever. Thoughts about features that would be nice, about data quality problems that could be solved, and that can be mixed in with further questions if you have them. And we are waiting for Connor to come on up. All right. So one way we might do this is actually, can I ask anybody who's potentially interested in contributing to this document to go ahead and log in to it now so that they can edit this Google document. Can everybody do that? If you've got thoughts you might want to contribute, give you a minute to go ahead and do that. If anybody has trouble, maybe Robert might help you with that trouble. Is that possible? If I pay Robert, he might help you with that trouble. Depends on how nice I am. Okay. Now, who has had a thought at some point during the day about a feature that would be nice to have, or some relationship between the existing tools that would be nice to increase, or whatever? Siegfried. Okay, all right. Who has a fully remembered thought of that nature? That's excellent, Siegfried. That's really so helpful.
So I already brought this up a couple times, but just making it official and putting it on the document, the ability to filter or group by the care site or provider. Because as we all know, locations and individual physicians have widely varying quality. So I think it would be interesting to group by those two parameters.
So maybe one way we could do this is that you've got a suggestion, anybody who wants to respond about how easy that might be to do, or questions about why that should be done, would be a way to kind of further that conversation. Does anybody want to respond to that?
So are you talking about the fact that things like the data quality within the NPES file was very poor? Or were you talking about something else?
I can talk about our setup, I guess. So we have a single CDM instance which contains data from multiple different clinics. And we distinguish them using care site, physician, and whatnot. We have we have 250 clinics and growing, so it's impossible to make a different CDM instance for each one. Or not feasible. It's not impossible.
But, so what is your unique identifier? Are you trying to use the national provider identifier? And is the data quality issue on that or something different?
No, just data quality, and not for those variables, but group by the variables. So all of the patients for a given care site, all the patients for a given physician.
Just like provider ID, care site ID, right?
Yeah.
Just being able to group by those things, not the quality of those things.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have that for provider ID. I don't remember for care site, just in terms of trying to see in the data quality dashboard, in terms of checking the referential integrity between provider table and I guess condition occurrence. But I think that's probably an area we need to grow further. To be honest, those two tables tend to be not as important with the claims data, and you've got a bunch of people with claims data that are writing this, so I think we need to enhance that for sure.
Use the pattern you guys have done by giving patients and how many conditions they have, patient, how many procedures they have. We could do the same thing for care site and provider IDs.
Yeah, so I think it's definitely doable with the current structure. It's just, we just need to add it.
Cool.
Yeah.
So sorry, do you want to? Okay, I just want to add, I think a couple things might be complicated about that. First, we have a hard time because there's so many, I think, providers and so many care sites, and some are used and some are not. And what might be, so we have, all these different institutions, and we created a field called site. And so it would be at a larger scale at what you're talking about. But if you knew like these clinics kind of belong together and are kind of one unit, you could then create kind of like another group identifier with them that might, yeah. Exactly. So it wouldn't be as granular as care site ID. But I do agree that that it would be a good way. And the way that we run the DQA, we do it by that, site. And so that output gets generated for each specific site. So if you had...
You do bring all of those disparate CDM or whatever databases, EHRs into one big CDM instance.
Yes. Yes.
Cool.
But then, and then for each one, there's, we run the DQA package for each site separately. You want to add to that? So you're the one who's actually running it, so.
No, I just say that's pretty much it. We just take in the data from each site, run the DQA, merge it together at the end. Yep.
Good suggestion. And good thoughts. And you said you wrote that on there already, so it's just not visible because we're not showing the part of the document that it's on. Is that right? Did you say you'd added it already? Oh, yeah. You did. Thanks.
Do you want us to scroll down, or do you want the link to stay?
Sure. Scroll down so we can see that people are adding things, if you could. Nice. All right, who on this list wants to talk about what they've put up there? Next. No, Mark says no. I refuse. Rima, do you want to talk about yours?
Thank you. I think it would be great if the rules were explicitly formalized in the data model and linked to the library of fields and tables. And same about phenotypes. And I think, especially phenotypes, and I think I'm not the only one who expresses it, it's complicated enough to define phenotypes, and if there are data quality rules that are phenotype specific, that link will be a tremendous support and will be a foundation for future automation.
What's that?
Yeah, it brought up a similar point, right?
Adam did. He did. And it's a point I've raised elsewhere. It's an excellent one. But thoughts from the group?
I mean, I mean, I think I said before that I agree that is probably a direction we'll need to head. But it's just kind of early days right now. But certainly, Rima, with getting the the CSV rules formalized into the CDM specification, I think that's something that perhaps we can partner on to get that done.
And even taking it further,
Mm.
if we could explicitly express the rules in something like OWL or shackle, which allows, or there is another markup language, so that we could distribute those and they become really more or less model agnostic if we're basing it on the concepts and rules.
Yeah.
And nothing of the kind exists. So it would be great. Just long-term vision.
Well, can I ask any of you to brainstorm on how, I mean, maybe with the data quality dashboard. So it produces a JSON object that's going to include concepts that might be related to those that are used to define a cohort, right? How might some structure be built out that links sort of current tooling around phenotyping or cohort definition development to the information in that JSON object about those concepts? Just a brainstorm, kind of where might that go?
So to basically be able to run those data quality checks against that population, that cohort population.
Not just the cohort population, but the things that were used to define that cohort population. So you've got concepts, you've got information about concepts that you have data quality flags that ran on that are in your JSON objects. You've got some of those concepts used to say this is, the inclusion criteria for this cohort to be used in this study. How do you link, what pathways might be used to link those two things so that you can begin to do that?
I mean, I can think of, when we do kind of start to integrate more with the web API, perhaps as you're building a cohort and, if you pre-specify a source that has the data quality dashboard results executed for, and you start to, use an inclusion criteria about a specific measurement, let's say, measurement concept ID, perhaps the results from the dashboard execution about that and kind of the compliance with that route could be available in Atlas as a pop-up or as some kind of additional information that augments it, kind of lets you know about it before you hit generate and go down a rabbit hole. So maybe something like that.
That would be fantastic. Yeah.
I just made it up, so great.
Yeah. Yeah. Let's do it.
It almost sounded like you were asking about cohort definitional drift as new codes change. Is that part of what you were getting at? No? Because I know a common challenge we have is we may define things based upon sort of ranges of codes. And when we define it, after we define it, new codes within that range may be added or codes within that range may be deprecated. But it's hard to get visibility that that's happening and then understand what the implications are. So it becomes almost time-based, taking a look at different points in time, what the set of, fully qualified set of codes are that define a cohort and how that fully qualified set changes at some future date. So we can then assess whether or not we're happy with those changes or whether we want to modify our cohort. But it sounds like that's a different issue, perhaps.
There's a little bit of a solution there, I might say, with Tantalus, because I think that tool allows you to essentially profile a new vocabulary that if you get a refresh from Athena, you get new vocabulary. I think it is meant to highlight those changes from one version to another, but that's just at the vocabulary level. But perhaps some linkage between that and, the data quality results could be possible. But anyways, yeah, check out Tantalus. I think that might be an avenue that you might want to check out.
Collaboration on checks between groups with a +1 is up there. So what do people think about that? What's the...
Then we're all in? Okay, cool. Yeah.
We're all in.
Easy.
Can we define some next steps on being all in? Is there a, should we schedule a call or?
Has there been?
Well, and there's a few that I'm going to group some that are redundant or slightly redundant or related.
It's okay if you get okays from people who whose differences.
He's checking the data quality of this list, I think.
Yeah.
Is there an ongoing data quality dashboard development call, or is that?
There
was at one point.
Yeah, we were doing it for kind of the sprint to get to here, to today, basically. But yeah, we need to kind of formalize a recurring session. So that's definitely going to happen after we get back.
All right. So you're going to be in touch with folks about setting that up. Fantastic. That is really fantastic. Maybe you guys could step and rather than me saying which of these to discuss next, why don't you guys pick one amongst these?
I'm just going to scroll down if you don't mind. I'm just going to see.
What you're thinking, the collaboration and curation one, I think you're kind of,
Yeah, I with those, and I'm not having somebody else.
Well, there was a very broad one on collaboration on DQ tools, right? Further up. So let's just isolate on that one. You guys can continue to curate the list. That's a great thing. But let's keep a discussion going while that's happening. So that's a wonderful and potentially naughty topic. What's the... Yeah, it is collaboration on DQ tools, I think, amongst you guys. Well, I think that was the data quality checks.
Yeah.
So tooling apart from checks.
Do we want to make one tool to rule them all, basically?
Or any combination of smaller or larger subsets of tools, maybe collaborate on making dozens of slight variations on existing tools and proliferating them. But no, I think, not necessarily a single tool, but is there any appetite for different kinds of collaboration on the tooling in the group? I guess that's a broad question. Tim says yes. Connor says yes.
I say yes, but I think it's once we talk about the data quality checks, I think between the tools and what they're doing, I think that's definitely a first step. We could talk about coding and all that after that, but I think just understanding the tools better and what the rules are better. So let's start there.
One thing that might get in the way is individual sites. If the people building these tools have different, what's the word I'm looking for? Needs in the back end for what their analysts are looking for. So we could all get together and kumbaya and try and build this new tool. But if what everyone's working on there doesn't line up with what's happening at home, then you're going to get another divergence again.
Yeah, that's true.
That's
Possibly.
true.
But you could have 90% of terminology between them, and so it will reduce the amount of work that will be required for a specific thing there. I can definitely think that's what DQ was working on, QC of specific to cohort there applies to every one of us, and we can identify with this kind of information. Is there a way to apply to, specific things that for them? No, it should be generic for every one of us. At least we'll be good.
And in this conversation about collaboration, I think even though we didn't have a presentation on DQueen, I think that's clearly there's a lot of value there. Everybody who saw that demo yesterday knows there's a lot of value there as well. So hopefully that larger conversation includes esteemed colleagues from Korea doing great work on DQueen. Who else has contributed something that they would like to discuss here? You've remembered what it is that you said before. No, this is not a question about curating the list. This is an actual idea. Okay.
Yeah, this is, so there's a gray area that's now a bunch of things grouped together that have to do with community stuff, standards, collaboration on tools, and collaboration on checks and governance. So anyway, there are several related ideas that are all in that group. And I just wanted to say, you know, we can talk about features for individual tools or features about particular value sets, but these things that require coordination across larger groups or curation or standards, I just thought we should address these all together.
Okay. And they may decide to disaggregate them because some make more sense than others, but I understand the motivation for linking them. They're all about collaboration. Who has a specific feature or a specific idea? Did you? Yeah.
Not a specific idea, but I think from the limited discussions that I have participated in so far is that there's a strong emphasis on technology. And there's a lot of people that have more like an IT background and that type of thing. And that will make it challenging for the long run. So that's also why I put some things in there about governance and people and other things. And when you want people to collaborate, everybody needs to know what the other participant is. It's about bringing multiple disciplines together to the table and truly collaborate. And maybe Odyssey could form something that would facilitate that. So not only facilitate GitHub and databases and tools, but also facilitate this part of it and how to bring the right people together, do a little bit of transformational things and change management and what have you. Otherwise, it's a long journey.
Well, I have some thoughts on that, and I'll just share them, and then you guys can think. So I think that's really true, and I think both PEDSnet and WAMI and the use of DQEC there had just a lot to teach the broader Odyssey community about the way in which these tools and all the IT actually come into play in a setting that requires that kind of collaboration that you're talking about, and the real use of a tool to monitor how data quality is improving across a set of institutions with a particular goal in mind. And I think there are particular challenges to doing that in a set of institutions that aren't bound together by a contract to do something, or they're not in a company that has to do that, or they don't have another kind of an incentive structure or obligation structure that says we've all agreed to share our data and to do this according to these. The purely voluntary and very loose nature of Odyssey is a slightly different beast, I guess, than some other entities where that makes sense. So I'm just teeing up a question where I completely agree with what you're saying, and I think you all have a lot to teach us about that. And so if you wanted to brainstorm about how you would translate similar kinds of things being done at a data coordinating center to a very open system where institutions aren't obligated to do what it is they're obligated to do in your settings, that would be great. Take it away.
So I think collaboration is key, but I also think on a real sense, there are very specific things that we have to accomplish on our end. So I think the most benefit we offer to the broader community would be to see what we have available in our toolkit that can be leveraged in a more general toolkit that's more openly available. So there's things that we may have already developed or checks that we may already have in place that may be of interest, but it's hard for me to stand here and say that I'm going to actively go out of my way to make mine match another within 90%. There are things that our toolkit has to do that are specific to the data model that we have. But I do think overall, from a technological standpoint, we have a lot of input to offer, and there's a lot of infrastructure we can contribute to in the larger space of things.
Go ahead again. I'm still thinking.
Yeah, I think, there's the theoretical component in which I think it's easy to not easy, but easier to exchange ideas than actual tools. And then there's, a level below that, which is the actual checks and how to standardize those and thinking about how to make that interoperable. And I think what we would need in order to be able to kind of, expand beyond what we need, our immediate use case to a larger use case would involve some sort of technology platform that is easily, that you can easily translate. So it might not be an easy tool, but it might be components of something that you can adapt. And I just think we have to come up with I think it's a matter of coming up with the right platforms for each of these levels of communication and sharing, because I can see it happening on so many different platforms and infrastructures. So.
I think if I understood your question correctly, you were asking what networks, people who have already been doing these network aggregations could teach the broader Odyssey community. Is that what you're thinking?
Not only what they can teach them, but how what's been learned in those settings might translate to one where the people aren't under contract to or haven't given some sort of pre-commitment, either for monetary reasons or because they're on a grant together to do the things that are happening in a data coordinating center. Institutions are usually bound in some sort of contract. We have to deliver on things, and that obligates you to start sharing data and to respond to people who are telling you there's stuff wrong with your data and all the kinds of things. That's really great that you guys are doing. That would be great to do at this larger level, but it lacks those incentives or obligatory structures that are part of the leverage for that. So it's sort of asking you to brainstorm about how to translate that to a setting with fewer constraints like that. Does that make sense?
I think so. My thoughts were on a different thing. So.
Oh, sorry. And did I adequately address, or was I changing the fundamental nature of your question when I add to it that way, or did I miss something? Yeah.
We see these challenges all the time. And if you truly want to get to a higher level of quality, etc., I was just saying and open some other mail in some totally different data domain, but there we talk about the master data quality level of an adherence across a big group around the world that went from 92% to 95 to 99 and now to 100. And I agree with you. It's easier to do it within a company or within a network than in a network. But I think there are examples out there where companies are working together, institutions are working together, and they put that in place. And visibility helps. So you can use other type of technologies and sharing metrics, etc., through GitHub and what have you, because in the end, people want to see that improvement. Everybody sees and knows their role, then they can actively contribute. I think that should be feasible in a certain amount of time.
I agree with you completely, and I think visibility is a good lever to try and leverage. That's wonderful.
So the Odyssey community has had just really astounding success amongst these sorts of activities, has gotten a kind of buy-in from different organizations, really diverse organizations, in a way that much better funded projects trying to do similar stuff have not succeeded at. And I don't know exactly why. I have my own ideas, but in terms of models and curated things and computable standards and things like that are out there, we've got a few examples of really powerful, successful things like vocabulary standards. Before Odyssey came around, we're doing pretty well. I mean, the WHO and SNOMED and the different organizations, they produced vocabularies. They were overlapping, but there's a lot of force behind them. We've got all these efforts for phenotype curation that are not doing quite as well. We've got repositories for clinical quality measures that do well because they've got reimbursement behind them. We've got value set repositories that do well because they're tied to the clinical quality measures that have reimbursement behind them. But have not got buy-in from a broader community, more diverse community. Anyway, I say all this because data quality checks are another of these types of things. So, when you take data model plus vocabulary plus value sets or concept sets plus quality measures, phenotypes, and data checks, and then common data elements, that kind of forms a universe of things that we would really love to be able to share broadly and that we need to have talk to each other because they're all part of the same sort of process. And with the data quality checks, getting a lot more attention in recent years so that we now have several efforts that are out there that could any of them be plausible ones to really get a lot of attention. I guess what I would say is maybe tying it to Odyssey would be a good thing. And, understandably, you guys have obligations that make it hard to just focus on that. But, you might get a lot of help. The effort from, I'm already forgetting the names, Ajit's and that one, that's already in Odyssey. And so I don't know. Did that make any sense?
I had a little trouble following at the end. So it sounded like you were saying that some set of standards have gained wide traction and that we might expect to find the same for data quality under some circumstances. Those circumstances were what eluded me in what you said. Sounded like maybe if we could get them to the status that common data elements have an NIH or something like that, that they would, the greater buy-in would lead to greater adoption and greater attention and greater performance, or some virtuous pathway with greater visibility by an official institution. But I'm making that up because I wasn't sure what you were saying at the end. But I may have been alone in not being clear about it. So do you all have thoughts on Siegfried's?
Well, I'm glad you remembered my name. But no, I think, there is a good history of success at Odyssey at moving things forward. I think there's a lot of passion in Odyssey to actually, not just theorize, but get things done. And if, the other efforts of my colleagues here, if they, wanted to, I guess, bring it into the mix as an Odyssey kind of effort, I'm sure that they would be seeing a lot of participation. But that's purely optional, and don't have to drink the Kool-Aid, whatever you want to do. But I think that's it's it definitely history has shown that. So I agree with that.
I'm not sure if it's within the scope of this group, but as I listen to the comments about the biggest studies that have been done, how do we make sure we're not overlapping people? Is there an effort to be able to either merge individuals across sites, I know they're de-identified, or to do some sort of phenotype of individuals so that you can do some sort of analytic way of saying it sounds as though these are the same person, I want to merge them together, but certainly at least deduplicating so we don't run the risk as we do these large studies that we say we've got millions of people and really it's only a very small subset of that because of the overlaps.
That is actually a very, very hot topic in PEDSnet right now. There's a lot. So one of the major undertakings that PEDSnet as a network has undertaken is to completely deduplicate the network. And they're using a vendor called DataVent, I think it's called. And it's called privacy preserving record linkage, where each site does, they pull like first name, last name, however they do it, and then apply an encryption and hashing method. And then that that is compared across sites in order to deduplicate. And there's a lot of, I think there's a lot of issues. So we've done it actually once for the PEDSnet antibiotics study, the demonstration project that they did. We deduplicated against our network and, or rather our network and a claims database in order to see what the overlap is. So there have been specific study contexts that we've done that in, and PEDSnet now is really interested in this, very, very interested. We as a network within PEDSnet, right now, we have Children's Hospital of Philadelphia and we have Nemours in Delaware, DuPont. And so there's obviously going to be huge overlap that we have not yet accounted for. And so we're trying to get those processes in place to deduplicate. Even with that, there's, I think, some complications about how good the match is, and there's a lot of governance issues. There's a lot of privacy concerning issues, and what happens when when we say that these are the same patient, but then there's conflicting clinical data around them. What do you do? And we haven't even gotten to the first step in order to even look to see what kind of issues would come up with that. But that is right now a very, very hot topic in data networks.
And we are
not allowed to be merged or identify duplicates there. So if you go to claims data from IBM, proven, and you will say, well, I also have centricity data, by contract, you precluded to identify that.
Yeah, we have that with
That's-
IBM and Optum, and we can't do that.
Yeah. So we are at time, and before you go, please give all of our wonderful presenters a big round of applause. I don't know about you, but I'm extremely excited by all the work they're doing and what it's going to mean for us. And thank you all very much for coming and for your ideas. And please fill out your evaluation form. You're going to receive email from Elise with the link for that. And please stay in touch and engaged and contribute.